Are you ready to make the most of your oil and gas mineral rights? Welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. Get the knowledge and resources you need to manage your minerals and royalties. Here is your host, Matt Sands.
Hello and welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Sands, and I'm here to help you make the most of your minerals and royalties. My guest this week is Ryan Fairbanks, who is a registered professional landman who helps entrepreneurial land professionals explore and expand their knowledge, opportunities, experience, community, and skills so they can prepare for and walk through their next career pivot. He does this through land skill mastermind groups, the private land skills network, individual pivot coaching, and the Landman Pivot podcast. He helps his clients develop their skills and mindset for the next opportunity. Ryan lives in rural Utah, nestled in the Rocky Mountains, and he has over 20 years' experience as an independent landman, project manager, independent author, and entrepreneur. Ryan has served on the RPL Education Committee, on the Utah Association of Petroleum Landmen Leadership Team, and he's currently serving on the board of directors of the Utah Royalty Owners Association. This was a really fun conversation where we explored a lot about the different aspects of career development, both in land and oil and gas and other areas, and then also talked about the ways that you can use a mastermind group to share best practices to get help. So be sure to check out his podcast, the Landman Pivot podcast, which we'll link to in the show notes. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Ryan Fairbanks, registered professional landman. Well, welcome, Ryan, to the Mineral Rights Podcast. I'm so glad that you are able to join us.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. I'm glad to be with you.
So before we dive in, let's talk a little bit about your background and give our listeners a little bit of insight into how you got into the land profession. So where did you grow up and where did you go to school?
Yeah, I grew up in central Utah, small town in Emery County, and moved to the Uinta Basin after college. Went to college in Price, Utah, so central Utah, still neighboring county to where I grew up. And after I was in Vernal, had a landman that moved here from Texas. He was raising his family down there, a couple girls, and John decided they didn't want to raise his family in urban Texas, and his wife was from Utah, and so they picked the Uinta Basin, came up here, had a couple clients that said, yeah, let us know when you get there and we'll see if we can get some work for you. And so he moved up here and was looking for some crew members, and we sat down to breakfast one day and he asked me some questions about my experience, and I'd done some things in sales, and he explained what leasing was like. The way he described it was kind of like reverse sales, where you call people who have an asset that's sitting dormant and offer them some money. I said, I think I can handle that.
Yeah, that seems like a pretty easy sell. I think usually royalty owners or mineral owners are happy to hear from a landman if they're making them a lease offer, because it means that there's a possibility of future royalty payments. So that makes sense. And so your schooling, you didn't go to school to become a landman then, I assume? It was just more
I
general?
did not.
Okay. What attracted you to become a landman and decide to make a career out of it?
Well, brother-in-law had started working with him a few months earlier, doing some abstract and starting to learn title work. And so I had a little bit of an introduction to it that way, what he was doing, and was aware of the detail level of work that was needed, and that there was going to be more to it than the leasing, that there was the title aspect to it. And that really fit well with kind of process-driven, detail-oriented things that I had done to that point. Really the opportunity to get to know a whole bunch of other people, mineral owners, and the team that I would be working with. It's kind of interesting because most of my life I've considered myself pretty much an introvert. And a lot of people, I think, would think of me as an introvert because I'm pretty quiet. But I just love being around people and getting to meet new people. And I'm curious about what they're doing and how they do that, and what drives them, what motivates them.
Yeah, that's cool. And I'm sure being a landman, you get the chance to meet a lot of new people, like you mentioned. Let's dive into the landman profession. For our listeners who might not be familiar, when we say landman, first of all, this is both men and women that work in the land profession. But what does a landman do in the oil and gas industry, generally speaking, and kind of what are the different types of people that work in that profession?
Yeah, the clearest and simplest explanation I've come up with for that is we research public property records and we negotiate contracts with mineral and landowners for energy development.
Okay, so that makes sense. So that's both oil and gas leases and then the surface use agreements.
Yeah, surface use agreements, right-of-way agreements.
And so what does a typical day look like for a landman? You're meeting with people often, but like how much of the time are you out boots on the ground, knocking on doors, making lease offers or making phone calls versus doing abstracting work in the county courthouse? What does that typical day look like?
You hear stories about being out and knocking on doors, and that really is kind of more rare than it used to be. Mid 70s through the 80s, that was kind of more the common. You send a landman out to a project and he goes to the courthouse and researches to figure out who the land and mineral owners are. Most of them live in the area where you want to develop their land, and their surface and mineral rights title was still together at that point, not having been severed. A landman in that era would go knock on a door and say, hey, I see you own the property here. I have a client that's interested in leasing your mineral rights. Can we maybe get a right-of-way agreement to go with that so we can access them? And it was that kind of conversation. And the landman during that era would take it from inception, an idea of the project, do some preliminary cursory research, move that along to contacting people, getting contracts, following up and getting them executed and recorded, all the way through drilling and development of the well and figuring out the pay deck and paying royalties. But nowadays it's a lot more available remote. Hear talk about people working remote, especially in the land industry, more and more since COVID. But I was working remote 75% of the time before COVID hit, where the client says, this is the area we want to develop. We have a database of mineral owners that, we've already done the research to know who owns the mineral rights. 95% of them are not the surface owners. So make phone calls, send them blank agreements, start negotiating. What do they want? What would they want? Here's our initial opening offer of what we'd like to lease for. Generally, the clients give you some kind of parameter. You have authority to lease up to a certain bonus, a certain royalty, a certain term. And then you try to make agreements within those parameters.
And that makes sense. I've heard of that as a common set of guide rails landmen are working within. I know in the past it was maybe somewhat common for landmen to get an overriding royalty interest if they're able to stay below those limits, and maybe there was some bonus depending on the terms that they were able to negotiate for. Is that still a common practice where part of your compensation as a independent landman would be an overriding royalty, or is it more just pretty much like your day rate and you're paid on an hourly basis?
Yeah, it's never been my experience. I mean, this is my 20th year in land, and it's never been my experience, and I've never even seen or been offered a contract that had those kind of terms where the landman got some kind of bonus or overriding royalty on the back end. A lot of that went away with the institution of professional associations like the AAPL and IRWA, where these professional landmen associations that focus on and have an ethics component to being licensed and registered with their organization. I don't know that it has to be that way, that there's any restriction. I mean, getting a piece of the deal, there's nothing inherently wrong with that, right? But I think from an ethical standpoint, the concern was, okay, to take away the risk that the landman in any way is going to try and short the land or the mineral owner, let's just remove that element altogether and remove it from contracts, remove it from compensation packages, so that there's no incentive necessarily for the landman to try and do anything. I mean, the client, the oil company or developer, is paying the landman their day wages. So there's inherent in that, you have a contract with a broker or directly with the energy company. They're your client. They're paying you. So there's already an incentive to do something that's in their best interest, to try and make a good deal for them so that the investment works for them and they can be profitable to drill and develop, produce. And their cut is the royalties, the working interest less the royalties that are owed to the mineral owners. In fact, I'm not sure I've ever had a conversation in 20 years with a landman who said, yeah, I did that kind of deal where I got an override. I mean, I've seen it in the records where you would see after the lease happened and got assigned to the operator, then an overriding royalty was assigned to a broker or a landman. But I haven't seen any of those kinds of assignments and overriding royalty back to the brokers. I've seen them in the records recently, but the last time one was recorded was 15 years ago.
Well, that's interesting to hear. Yeah, that makes sense what you mentioned. And, you mentioned the AAPL. So you want to talk a little bit about that organization and your involvement with
Sure.
that and sort of what that organization is all about? Because I think it's really been a very helpful organization, at least from the outside, looking at the land profession and the resources they have available for landmen.
Yeah, so it's the American Association of Professional Landmen. Used to be petroleum landmen, but then they transitioned into doing all kinds of different land work because title is title and negotiating is negotiating. And so in the last 5 years, we've seen transition to them involving more renewable energies. So you have wind and solar, geothermal, mining, hard rock, and utility easements. So a lot of different components that come into that. Even changed all of their documents and their policy relating to all of those other kinds of land professionals. They have 3 levels of certification. A registered landman is basic level, an RPL, registered professional landman, and then the CPL, certified professional landman, are the 3 levels of certification. And there's tests for each level, different level of study and competence, years in the profession required to attain each level of certification as a landman.
That's good to know. And then I think the thing to think about from a mineral and royalty owner perspective is if the landman that you're working with to lease your minerals is an RPL or a CPL, there are, like you mentioned earlier, there's an ethics component to that. So that's a level of comfort that you can have that person is going to be acting in good faith, negotiating the lease and that kind of a thing. So I think it's a definite benefit from a mineral and royalty owner perspective as well. How do you see that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the ethics part of it is you're representing not just the client, but you're representing the whole land industry to the mineral owners that you're talking to. And so they do put an emphasis on that to make sure they have accountability. And if there's an issue from an ethical standpoint, there's reporting and ways that people can review what's a situation. If there's been an issue that somebody has an issue with, the AAPL is very interested in being aware of that and making sure that people are dealing ethically with their clients as well as mineral owners.
That's great. So what you were describing earlier in your work, it was working on behalf of oil and gas companies to lease minerals and surface and things like that. Tell me a little bit about how long did you work in that role? Did you work ever within, as an in-house landman or versus have you always been an independent landman? And what's your career path been?
Yeah, I've always been an independent landman. So I started off doing leasing. I had a couple of different mineral development projects where the clients that we were working for had specific prospects that they wanted us to acquire leasehold. And so they'd define an area, we'd get title, and I was given title records, in most cases just a spreadsheet of here are the mineral owners within this section or this group of sections of land. Approach them, try and get a lease deal that everybody can be comfortable with. So I did that exclusively for 2.5, 3 years. As a part of that, you get familiar with title. Like you call somebody up and they say, well, yeah, that was my parents' interest, but they're deceased. Well, did they do a probate? What's the handoff from them to the next generation? Did they have a trust? Are we dealing with they died more than 3 years ago in the state of Utah? Each state's a little bit different, but where the minerals are located, what are the rules of how intestate succession happens to pass from one generation to the next without probate? Doing the leasing, you start learning a lot of those kinds of things. You have mineral owners that go, oh, I didn't even know I owned mineral rights. Well, are you the right John Smith? Am I even talking to the right person? Was this your dad or grandpa? And you start connecting those dots. And then you figure out, okay, I'm talking to the right person. Maybe we have some curative things that need done. Who has authority to sign a lease even? And then you work through those processes. After that, I started learning more in depth and running title, where you go into the courthouse or nowadays more and more counties, even small counties in Utah, in West Texas, in Oklahoma. There are a lot of counties that for many years resisted putting their records online. As much as we don't necessarily want to say, hey, COVID really helped us with that. COVID helped us with that because it encouraged a lot of counties who were resistant to digitize their records and make them available online to do that, because it was the only way they could get any revenue from having those records and allowing people to have access without people having to go into the recorder's office.
Yeah, and that's a huge benefit. Like you mentioned earlier, a lot of the mineral and royalty owners now, since the minerals have been severed and those have been passed down generation to generation, they're off living in different states. And to your point, people find out that they own minerals or royalties. Often it's the first time they hear about it is from the call from the landman when they're offering to lease their minerals. I know Justin, my co-host, has had that same situation occur, and to where his mom got that call and she said, "No, I think you have the wrong person. I don't own any minerals or royalties." And, well, was this person your great uncle? Yeah. Okay. Well, then you're the rightful heir, part of this. So we need to get things squared away, but you are the right person that we're talking to. And so then you start this journey of, okay, what else might be out there? What do I own? And I think it's always a good idea for mineral and royalty owners to become familiar with that county clerk and recorder's office and the online search, if it's available, to do some research on your own and see, are there other minerals out there that maybe there's not current development going on to where there isn't a lease offer, but maybe there was a deed out there and it mentions multiple mineral tracts. And so I think it's a good way to get informed doing some research on your own. But yeah, it's a steep learning curve for sure. Trying to figure out all the ins and outs of the different types of interests and the documents you need to worry about and all those things. So you work as an independent landman, and I understand you worked for a while for a broker and maybe some of that on your own. Like, when did you start Landrunner Inc., your current company? And tell me a little bit about that journey and what you do.
Yeah, I started Landrunner Inc. in 2015. I was thinking about, we had incorporated our business under a different name, and I thought that name it doesn't say anything about land. It was kind of an abbreviation with my wife and my initials, and it just didn't say anything about doing land work. And I thought, well, I ought to do something that at least says, hey, we do land work. I've always been a runner. I like to run. I did track and cross country in high school and played soccer in college. I've done not some big races, like I've never done a full marathon or anything huge like that, but I've done a half marathon and I've done a bunch of 5 and 10K runs, and I just like to run. I like to go jog. And so I thought, well, I'm doing land work and I like to run. And when you need to figure out the title, you're running the title. So that's how we came up with the name of Landrunner. But in 2015, I was thinking about shifting the name of our company that I was doing work through a broker to Landrunner, and I set it up, and then we never really made that transition with the broker. So I had it there. Then I started thinking, okay, the crew that I'm on, we have mineral lessors and lessees. So as representative of the client, we're trying to lease mineral rights. There are people on our crew that focus on running the title for mineral rights and leasing. But I was not involved in that crew very much. I mean, they were part of the crew. We had a shared office space of a bunch of independent contractors. I mean, not a bunch, a dozen or so independent contractors that shared this office space. At that point, I was doing right-of-way work, surface stuff, and managing a right-of-way project for surface use agreements for well site locations and right-of-way access to get to those well site locations. As a project manager, not necessarily managing, because you're all independent contractors. It was an interesting thing to do as an independent contractor, to be a leader for other independent contractors, but they're not my employees. They're also working for the same broker doing the same kind of work I was doing. But somebody needs to kind of organize the work and who's doing what. And so I was helping facilitate that. And I realized at that time, been in the industry about 10 years. I have a little bit of experience. I haven't been in the industry 30 years. I don't know everything, but maybe I can help other guys who are in the business or getting started or want to get started in the business that are a few steps behind me, brand new guys in the industry, and serve somebody else. I'm an independent contractor, so inherently that carries with it the implied you need to be doing other work besides the one client that you're working for, and have that opportunity for growth and to have other contracts and other clients. I said, as an independent contractor, I'm going to do that. Who can I help? Who else can I serve? I certainly can't have overlapping contracts where I have a broker and I tell 5 clients that I'm working full time for them all of the time. That's unethical, right? That's dishonest. I'm not going to do that. But who else can I serve? Who else can I help? So I started getting into the space of doing a podcast and writing a manuscript for a book. As part of that, I had a conversation with a man who was involved in coaching and mastermind groups. And he said, it sounds like you have some experience that would be valuable for people who are a few steps behind you, and you enjoy the engagement with people. Maybe you might want to start a mastermind group. Have you ever thought about that? And I was familiar with the concept a little bit from the book Think and Grow Rich. And there's a number of other books and resources that talk about the concept of a mastermind group, where you bring people together that have a similar interest and figure out ways to collaborate and support and help each other on your journey. I started exploring that and pulling some people together and launched a mastermind group.
So that initial mastermind group, was it other landmen, other independent landmen that you were meeting together, sharing ideas, best practices, those kinds of things? Or what was that first group like?
Yeah, really the impetus for that first group was I met a rookie who was in his senior year in college. So a little different than I didn't go to college to be a landman, but I'd been in the business for 10 years. I came up in the field, in the trenches, so to speak. And he was concerned. I mean, this was pre-COVID, but the industry, if you think about what was going on in the oil and gas industry, 2018, 2019, it was kind of a tumultuous time in the industry. A lot of political attacks against natural gas and oil and fossil fuels in general. And he was going, well, I'm about to graduate, but am I even going to have work when I graduate? Is there even going to be an oil and gas industry in 5 years? So came alongside him and encouraged him. And that was kind of the impetus for that initial group is let's bring together a handful of guys, rally around this guy and help him walk through that transition of finishing his last year in college and getting on his feet in the industry. So we did that and we pulled together a handful of guys. One guy was a mentor that I had connected with through the RPL's mentorship program. And that's something that they're still doing, where they'll pair rookies or people who are going through a transition or getting into a new aspect of land work with somebody who's a seasoned professional in that specific area and help them develop those skills and their network and relationships so that they can make that transition. One of the people that I brought into the group was one of my mentors that I'd connected with through RPL. I had a brother who himself was a little bit of a rookie getting into land work and had done some abstracting and title work. A guy who I was participating in his mastermind group as an entrepreneur. I'd never run a mastermind group. I'd facilitated like group meetings and in-person kind of stuff, but it was brand new to me. I asked a guy whose group I was participating in if he'd come and participate and just give me backup support, kind of help manage the Zoom meeting while we were getting going. And then a couple of other seasoned professionals that had 10, 15, 20 years experience. We brought together a college professor that's very involved in the training of land professionals in a formal environment. So we had a variety of experience that was all really valuable for this rookie that was getting started.
That sounds amazing. I wish that those types of opportunities were there. And I would say that maybe it wasn't as structured as what you're talking about. I was very fortunate when I started my career in having some mentors that really took me under their wing, helped me learn about, in my case, what it was like to be a project engineer working in pipelines and helping to understand the ins and outs of that. I can only imagine the value that he received from you all sitting him down, helping him learn the ropes. Normally, it's like trial and error. You're on your own trying to figure it out. And I would imagine, especially as an independent landman, where you are not part of a company that has structured training and structured career progression. So that's a really cool thing you set up. Tell me a little bit more about the podcast. You mentioned you have the Landman Pivot podcast. What do you talk about on that show, and what are some of the types of guests you have?
So we're just getting ready to release our season 3. In the first couple of seasons, really focused on mentors and coaches. And so people in and out of the oil and gas industry,